Hi, everyone. Let's spend some time talking about in-text citations, especially MLA in-text citations. You recall from studying the Introduction to MLA Documentation video that in order to avoid plagiarism, we need to use both elements of documentation. One important element is the bibliography, which in MLA is called works cited. The second, equally important element is in-text citations. In-text citations identify which specific information in our paper came from which of the sources listed in our bibliography. While some documentation styles, particularly those that place bibliography entries in footnotes instead of on a separate bibliography page, use numbers, both MLA and APA use what is referred to as parenthetical citation because the citation is often enclosed in parentheses. Now, both APA and MLA in-text citations use the first item in the bibliography entry for the in-text citations. APA in-text citations include the year of publication, while MLA in-text citations include the page numbers that include the information discussed in the paper. Okay, let's discuss some of the general rules regarding using MLA in-text citation. Keep in mind that the function that in-text citations serve is to indicate very briefly which specific source on the works cited page supplied the information. Since that is their function, the in-text citations should be designed to make it very easy to find the source on the works cited page. Therefore, the in-text citation is the first item in the works cited entry that it refers to. Now, since the works cited entries are alphabetized, and the first line of each entry is the only line of the entry that is not indented half an inch, a reader should be able to locate the correct source by simply scanning down the left margin of the works cited page. Readers should not have to read through the works cited entries to determine which source is referred to by an in-text citation. In most cases, the in-text citation will be the name of the author or authors of the work. As we'll discuss shortly, there are two ways to format in-text citations. One method uses strictly parenthetical citations. If we choose to use a parenthetical citation, the author's name or names in that citation use the last names only, not the first names or initials. If there are two authors, the names are separated by the word "and." The word, not an ampersand. If there are three or more authors, the parenthetical citation is formatted the same way it is in the works cited entry. It's the last name of the first author listed on a source, followed by et al., and that's E-T-A-L, period. If the source has no author, the first item in the works cited entry will generally be the title of a work. Therefore, the in-text citation uses the title of the work, and it will be formatted exactly the same way it is formatted in the works cited entry. If it's the title of an article, a short story, an essay, a poem, a song, an individual web page, an episode of a TV series, or any other kind of a source that's part of a longer work, the title is generally enclosed in quotation marks. If it's the title of a newspaper, magazine, academic journal, book, record album, movie, video, an entire website, a TV series, or any other work that is not usually enclosed in a different kind of work, it's italicized. I know that can sound confusing, but if it seems confusing, study how the works cited entries are formatted, because doing that will help clarify what I mean. Also, it's important to note that any title within the body of a paper that's written in MLA style will be formatted the way it would be formatted in a works cited entry, whether it's part of an in-text citation or not. Also, keep in mind that in-text citations should be brief so that they don't disrupt the reader's flow. If the title of the work is long, shorten it by using only the first few words. Just make sure that you don't use wording that could refer to two different entries on the Works Cited page. For example, if you have two sources that begin with the words disadvantages of online education, and there's no author for either of them, you'll need to use slightly longer versions of the titles in the in-text citations so that readers can determine which source they refer to. In MLA, most in-text citations include the numbers of the specific pages in the source that the information in that paragraph is taken from. Now, some sources obviously don't have page numbers. Movies, TV shows, and websites don't have page numbers. But most articles available through the CSN library website can be downloaded in PDF format. PDF formats of articles do have page numbers. If you use a source that is available in PDF, and the PDF version includes page numbers, you will be expected to use page numbers in the in-text citations. Now, of course, there are a number of exceptions and variations to both the use of authors' names or titles and the use of page numbers. It's important to have looked through the resources that you're using to study MLA well enough to be familiar with exceptions to the rules and how to format in-text citations for those exceptions. Now, it's important to keep in mind that in-text citations do not carry over from one paragraph to another. If you cite page 3 of a source named Smith in the third paragraph, and the information for the fourth paragraph also comes from page 3 of Smith, you have to repeat the citation in the fourth paragraph, even though it's exactly the same as the citation for the paragraph right before it. In papers for most courses, including this one, the only paragraphs that don't need in-text citations are the introduction, the conclusion, and any paragraph that's used strictly to transition from one subtopic to another. If the information in the introduction, conclusion, and transition paragraphs simply summarize information that is attributed to sources that are cited through in-text citations elsewhere in the paper, those paragraphs don't need in-text citations. But since most undergraduate papers require that statements be supported by information from sources, every paragraph except the introduction, conclusion, and transitional paragraphs should have at least one in-text citation. That is certainly true of the research-driven papers written for this course. Now, in addition, if there's a direct quote in the paragraph, the quote must have its own separate citation, even if it's exactly the same citation that you use for the rest of the information in the paragraph. Also, the citation for the quote doesn't count as the citation for the entire paragraph. So even if the citation for all of the information in the paragraph is exactly the same as the citation for the quote, you have to repeat it. Now, sometimes the information in one paragraph comes from more than one source. In that case, you need a citation for each source cited in the paragraph, and the citations must indicate which information in that paragraph comes from which source. Let's take an example. If the information in a couple of sentences in the paragraph comes from a source named Smith, you include a citation for Smith after those sentences. Then if the next two sentences come from a source named Jones, you need a citation for Jones after those sentences. And if the sentence following the information taken from Jones is taken from the same Smith article already cited in the paragraph, you need another citation for Smith accompanying that sentence, even if it is exactly the same Smith citation that already appears in the paragraph. But if all the information in a paragraph comes from the same source and there are no direct quotes, and that's usually the case, then you usually need only one in-text citation in each paragraph. It isn't necessary to include an in-text citation for each sentence or to include two citations just because the paragraph happens to be long. There are actually two ways to format in-text citations in MLA. While both are valid methods of documentation, one way is more useful in helping readers identify which specific information in a paragraph came from a specific source. The best way to cite information, because it's most useful to readers, is to introduce the information with a signal phrase, such as according to so-and-so or so-and-so states. The first time you use a signal phrase for an in-text citation for a source, you need to include a very brief statement that explains how the source is connected to the topic. A job title often serves as a good identifier in cases like that. Sometimes introductions to books or special information in or added as footnotes to articles and websites explain what makes that author a reliable authority on the topic. If nothing else is available, just use the word author. In addition, you must use the first name or names of sources the first time you use a signal phrase for a particular source. Now, you need to include this information the first time you use a signal phrase to introduce information from a source, even if you used a parenthetical citation for a course in previous paragraphs. But if you use a signal phrase as a citation for a source in additional paragraphs after you've already identified the source and used his or her first name, use only the last name. You don't need to repeat the other identifying information if you've already stated it in the paper. If you use this method to format in-text citations, you need to put the page numbers in parentheses at the end of the last sentence of information taken from the source. Here are some examples of how to format in-text citations using signal phrases. The first example demonstrates how a signal phrase and parenthetical citation for page numbers is formatted the first time you use a signal phrase to cite that particular source. The second example demonstrates how a signal phrase and parenthetical page number citation in paragraphs that appear after you've already provided the first names in connection to the topic would look. The final example demonstrates how to format in-text citations using signal phrases if there is no author. Now, that last example assumes that the first item in the works cited entry is the title of an article that begins with the words dealing with weather. By the way, you wouldn't actually need sources for any of the information in these examples because it's all really common knowledge, right? But I just wanted to make up some short phrases to use as examples that I didn't really need to go and look up a source for. It's taking long enough to make these videos as it is, okay? The second way that in-text citations can be formatted in MLA style is to use what is called parenthetical citation. When you use parenthetical citation, put both the first item in the works cited entry for that source and the page numbers where the information can be found in parentheses. In MLA, parenthetical citations are usually placed after the information taken from the source. In many cases, all of the information in a paragraph is taken from one source, and there are no direct quotes. In that case, put the parenthetical citation at the end of that paragraph. Let's take a look at some examples. The first example is a parenthetical citation for a work written by an author named Smith. We don't include the author's first name in the parenthetical citation unless our paper has two sources with the same last name. Now, as we see in the example, The name is followed by the page numbers, and there is no comma between the author's name and the page numbers. Okay, let's move on to the second example. The second example demonstrates how to format a parenthetical citation for a work with two authors. Again, only the last names are used, and there is no comma between the author's name and the page numbers. But notice that the names are connected with the word "and" spelled out, not an ampersand. Okay, let's take a look at the third example here. The third example demonstrates how to format a parenthetical citation for a source with three or more authors. Now, there is a period after AL because AL is an abbreviation for the phrase et alia. That's a Latin phrase meaning "and others," and most abbreviations end with a period. But there is no comma separating the phrase "et al" from the page numbers. The next example demonstrates how to format a parenthetical citation from an article with no author. And then the final example demonstrates how to format a parenthetical citation for a movie that's available on DVD and in streaming video. Now, most sources are articles or books, so most parenthetical citations include the author's name or names or a shortened version of the title and the page numbers. But there are exceptions. Make sure to study the resource that you use to guide you in working with documentation well enough to know what the exceptions are. No one expects you to memorize all the rules, but you do need to be able to identify special cases so that you know that you need to look up how to do those citations. The final rule to note about citations concerns punctuation. We've already discussed the fact that the author's name, title, or whatever is used to identify the source, and the page number or time indications are not separated by a comma. But it's also important to discuss how to punctuate the sentence. We notice that whether a signal phrase is used or not, there will usually be a parenthetical citation at the end of a paragraph taken from a source. Now, obviously, the text in that section of the paragraph will conclude with a sentence, and the parenthetical citation will follow the final sentence. Now, the period ending the final sentence taken from a source comes after the parenthetical citation, not before it. So instead of having a period here after blue, we have one here after the parenthetical citation. Let's take a look at that example a little bit more closely. Note that the author's names are separated with the word and no comma. Notice that there's no comma between the author's names and the page numbers. And finally, notice that the period that ends the sentence, "the sky is often blue," comes after the parenthesis that closes the parenthetical citation. Now, yeah, this is all little nitpicky stuff, but that's just the nature of documentation. And some professors are really picky about this stuff. But remember, you don't have to memorize these rules. For in-text citations and for works cited entries, all you need to do is use an MLA style guide and look up examples. Then just copy the formats that are used in the examples and copy them exactly. Yeah, it's really nitpicky, but it's not difficult because it's just a matter of taking the time to look up examples and copying the format exactly. Now, there are many special circumstances that might require you to use different formatting for in-text citations. There are far too many of them to cover in one video, and really most of them are used fairly rarely. But there is one special circumstance that we use quite often, so I wanted to spend a couple of minutes going over it. Sometimes You'll want to use information that a book or article that you read indicates came from an outside source. After all, some of the material you use for sources will be written for academic audiences, and the authors of those articles and books have to cite sources too, just like we do. In that case, the source is referred to as an indirect source. Now, your textbook refers to this type of source as a secondary source, but that's not what it's called. Most MLA style guides, including the Purdue OWL, refer to this as an indirect source. So that's the name you should get used to using when you look for rules on how to format indirect sources. Now, what you're actually doing in this case is citing a source within a source. You're basically saying, an article I read by Smith says that an article written by Jones indicates whatever. But that's too wordy. Instead, you would indicate that Jones made the statement originally by using a signal phrase, and then indicate that you actually read the information in an article written by Smith by using a special parenthetical citation beginning with QTD period N. Here's an example of what that would look like in a paper. Now, if the source you actually read, in this case Smith, provides identifying information for the source that he or she cites, such as the first name and connection to the topic, you would include that in the signal phrase. For example, you might write, according to astrophysicist Mary Jones, the sky is blue. But in this course, if the source you read doesn't provide that information, don't worry about it. Now, some profs might be really picky and ask you to conduct additional research to determine what Jones's first name is and what her connection is to the topic. But I don't expect you to do that in this course. Instead, you would just use a signal phrase, according to Jones, to indicate that the following information was originally stated by a source named Jones. Then you write your information, for example, the sky is blue. And then after the information, whether that's one sentence or the rest of the paragraph, you have a parenthetical citation that looks like this. It's parenthesis QTD period, and the Q is not capitalized, N, and that's IN, then the name of the source you actually read, which in this case would be Smith, and the page numbers in Smith that you found the information on. Now, like I said, I know this stuff is really picky and it can be kind of confusing. Anytime that you have a question on how to cite a source, always ask your professor. The Writing Center on the campus nearest you can also be really, really helpful with MLA documentation because they know it really, really well. People at advising and coaching can help you with that too. And in this class, if you have a question, just send me a copy of the paragraph that you want to know how to cite and the information from the works cited entry, or preferably the actual works cited entry, and I'll be happy to email you back and tell you how to do the citation. Okay, now that we've covered some of the basic rules of MLA in-text citations, let's go through a paper and see how the citations would actually be used. This is the sample paper that I posted to Canvas and that you should have in front of you while we finish the rest of this discussion. And this is the works cited page that's also posted to Canvas that you should have in front of you while we finish this discussion. Okay. Now, I have gone through this paper and made some notes as to where I need to include citations and which source that I took the citations from. Now, as I've said, There are two ways to do this. You can go ahead and add your citations as you type out the zero draft of your paper, or you can put notes in the paper indicating which source information is taken from and go back through and add your citations later. Personally, I prefer to add them as I type out my zero draft. But obviously, I don't expect you to sit here and watch me write up an entire zero draft, so we're going to do it the other way this time. Let's go through paragraph by paragraph and see what we need. Now, the first paragraph is an introduction, and I'm not going to read this paper to you or give you time to read it as we go through the video. But if you read through this, you'll see that there's really nothing in the introduction that isn't discussed in more detail with information from sources that do have citations later in the paper. Since there's no information in this paragraph that isn't discussed later in the paper and that we don't cite a source for, we don't really need a citation for the introduction. But we come to our next paragraph and we see that the information in this paragraph, and we know this because I made a note of it, came from the Issues and Controversies article. Now, if we go through this and read it, we see that here it says experts from Teen Screen, which means that the information following this phrase actually came from a source called Teen Screen, which I'm assuming is probably a website. But and let's pretend I wrote this paper, but I didn't actually look at the website from Teen Screen. I actually took this information from the Information and Controversies article, and the Issues and Controversies article cited the Teen Screen source. So this is one of those situations where I have an indirect source. So what I want to do for my citation is, first of all, remember to delete the period from the last sentence. And as we learned, and as you can confirm by checking in your textbook or the Purdue OWL, the format we need to cite an indirect source is QTD period IN, and then the first item in the works cited entry that provides information for that source. And this source, as we said, is our Issues and Controversies article. And our Issues and Controversies article, as we see by looking at our works cited page, is titled Antidepressant Drugs or Antidepressant Drugs Safe for Young Patients. The first item in the works cited entry is the title. It is not Facts on File, Issues and Controversies. So what we want in the in-text citation is the title, or in this case, a shortened version of the title, which would be Antidepressant Drugs. And we see that the title in the works cited entry is enclosed in quotation marks. So that's what we want to do in our in-text citation too. So we have QTD in quotation marks, and let's make sure we have the wording right, antidepressant drugs. Oops. All important words and titles are capitalized, of course. Now, we know from the video that we studied on in-text citations that, of course, we would know it if we had the source in front of us, which we would if I was actually writing this paper. I'd have the source available to double check. But we only have so much space on our video screen, and I can't have everything open at one time. But we know that this source doesn't have any page numbers. Okay? So all we need to do is add our closed parenthesis and a period, and that citation is finished. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. Now, as we read through the paragraph, we see, oh, it says here that this is an article in the New York Times. Well, will that work as an in-text citation? Let's check our Works Cited page. Do we see anything on the Works Cited page that begins New York Times? Nope, we don't, because it would be right here. After all, this is alphabetized, right? Okay, so what source did come from the New York Times? Well, I'll let you read through the entire Works Cited page yourself, but we see that the source that came from the New York Times is actually an article titled Risks of Antidepressants. And the first item in the Works Cited entry is Risks of Antidepressants. It's a title, and it's enclosed in quotation marks. So what we want here is double check the wording, risks of antidepressants. And I would have the article in front of me, but even if I didn't, this is a one-page article, and the page number is A26. So I know that, of course, I need the closed quotation marks for my title, and then I need A26 for my page number. Whoops. My close parenthesis and the period to end my sentence. Okay. Now, I made a note for myself that the rest of this information comes from Miller. And the source Miller is Matt Miller. And it's a website, so there are no page numbers for it either. But to be different and also to add some variety to my paper and help readers more, I'm going to use a signal phrase to introduce this information. It needs to be in black type. So I'm going to say, according to, and his first name is Matt, M-A-T-T. Oh, but wait a minute. I need to identify who Matt Miller is in connection with antidepressants. Now, I did some research, and I made some notes on my notes here, that Matt Miller is a science writer. So I'm going to say and science writer isn't a formal title, it's just a job title. So it doesn't need to be capitalized. Science writer Matt Miller states, and that takes care of the parentheticals of the in-text citations for this paragraph, because since the Matt Miller source is a web page, it doesn't have any page numbers to put in parentheses. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. Now, I've made a note that all of the information in this paragraph comes from the source REINB, and that's a shortened version, an abbreviation of the name Shauna Reinblatt. Okay, so that means that for this paragraph, I need a citation that is REIN. Let's make sure we get her name spelled correctly here. REINBLATT. And I notice on my Works Cited page that it's Reinblatt et al., which means that there must have been 3 or more authors for this article. So I will have Reinblatt, Reinblattetal, period. Okay. And I made a note to myself here that the specific pages that this information came from are 119 through 120. So I put my page numbers as 119-20, close my parenthesis, not 200, close my parenthesis, add my period. Notice that there's no comma between the name of the author and the page numbers. Okay, now the next paragraph presents some interesting situations. We notice that the rest of the paragraph came from Miller. Now, we've already, earlier in the paper, used a signal phrase for this source. And in that signal phrase, we've already identified that Miller's first name is Matt and that he is a science writer. So we don't need to repeat that information again. All we need to do is say, according to Miller, it is very difficult and blah, blah, blah. Now, if we look down a little farther, we see that this paragraph discusses a Harvard University study. But again, pretending I wrote this paper, I know that I didn't actually read that Harvard University study, and I don't want my readers to think that I did. So just to clarify, I'm going to add here that something that indicates that I took this information from my Miller source. And a simple way to do that here would be to say, but he points out that, because there's only one person that he could refer to in this paragraph, and that would be Miller. Okay, and that will clarify that well enough for a paper for this class. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead too. This sentence is the only sentence that includes information that came from this Harvard University study. So to make sure that that's absolutely clear to my readers, I'm going to add another signal phrase here. Miller adds that other research indicates. That just kind of helps clarify for my readers that the rest of the information in this paragraph did come from the Miller article, but it didn't necessarily come from the Harvard University study. Is that absolutely necessary in this class? No. In this class, I probably wouldn't take off if a student had written this paper with this paragraph and just cited Miller at the end of the paragraph. That probably would have been fine. But as you go on in college, you'll find that you need to be a little bit more particular in how you use your citations, because the longer that you work in a field, the more you'll understand how important it is. How important it is that readers be able to identify the information of sources, or the source of information. I'll get that right fairly one of these days, won't I? Okay, the next paragraph is just a transitional paragraph. Okay, it moves from discussing a couple of concerns into discussing the greatest concern. There's nothing in this paragraph that isn't discussed in more detail either before or after this paragraph, and the information that is provided in more detail does include an in-text citation. So since this is just a transitional paragraph with no information in it that isn't cited in the paper elsewhere, I don't need an in-text citation for this paragraph. Okay, now I've made a note for myself that all of the information in this paragraph came from my Issues and Controversies article. So I need a citation for my Issues and Controversies article. And looking at our Works Cited page, we recall that the Issues and Controversies article has this title, Antidepressant Drugs or Antidepressant Drugs Safe for Young Patients. And we've worked with this article before, and we've used the shortened title, Antidepressant Drugs, so we'll be consistent and do that again here. And again, we know that Issues and Controversies is a source that doesn't have any page numbers. So all we need for the citation here is a shortened version of the title, which would be Antidepressant Drugs, in quotation marks, with the period that ends the last sentence in the paragraph after the parentheses. Okay, that one's done. And I'm going to save this because it's always a good idea to save your work fairly frequently as you edit it. Do you see what I did? In moving from one document to another, I accidentally put this citation in the wrong paragraph. I meant to put it here. Now, I accidentally erased it a minute ago, but I also made a note, or had a note here earlier, that this next paragraph also came from my Issues and Controversies article. Now, yes, even though I cite the Issues and Controversies article, Antidepressant Drugs, in this paragraph, and the very next paragraph comes from the same source and has exactly the same citation, I have to repeat the citation in this paragraph because citations do not carry over from one paragraph to another. Okay, and then I see that this paragraph comes from my source named Henry, which is here, and we see that that's Henry et al., which means that there are 3 or more sources. And I made a note that of the pages that I used. But if we look at this article, we see that it says results of studies varied, but at least 3 major studies using randomization, double-blind controls, and placebos, and then it names the studies. Okay? Now, I need to indicate that I didn't actually read these studies. I took this information from an article that I did read by a guy named Henry. So again, we're going to use our indirect source citation format, which is QTD period IN Henry et al. Period, and the page numbers that this came from are 1187 through 89. And then we have our close parentheses and our period. The last paragraph is a conclusion, and the conclusion doesn't have any information in it that isn't discussed earlier in the paper in more detail, and that information, of course, is accompanied by an in-text citation, so we don't need a citation here. So, the next thing we need to do, not entirely sure what kind of word gobbledygook that is, but I don't want it there, so I'm going to get rid of it. The next thing we need to do is to add our Works Cited page to our draft. And to do that, we have to remember that we want the works cited page to start on a brand new page. So you go to Insert, Break, Page Break, and that will start a new page in Microsoft Word. Then we go to the working works cited page that we have already made up for this paper, and you would have made it up before writing your zero draft, just as we made this works cited page up when we completed the video on how to set up a works cited page. And we'll copy it. We'll bring it over and paste it on the new page of our Word document. Now we want to look through it and first of all make sure that the formatting didn't get screwed up when we copied and pasted it. Word didn't used to screw up the formatting when you did that, but you know they just keep improving Word, if you want to call it improving it. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we need to go through and make sure that every source that is cited in our paper is included on the works cited page. Because if we cite a source in our paper and we don't have an entry for it on the works cited page, that's plagiarism. Now, the way we would do this, if I were actually writing this paper, I would go through and read the entire paper again and make a note of every source that's cited so that I know which ones are cited and which ones aren't. Obviously, I'm not going to take up your time in this video doing that. So I can tell you that I know that yes, every source that is cited in this paper is included on the works cited page. But I will also tell you that another thing that we need to do is go through and make sure that every source that's listed on our works cited page is actually directly cited in our paper. Now you remember that in the video on how to construct a works cited page, I urged you to construct a working works cited page before you write your draft, because as you saw when we went through this, the way you determine what goes in your in-text citation is that it's whatever appears first in your works cited entry. Well, you can't know what's first in your works cited entry if you haven't written up the entry, right? Okay, but when I wrote up my works cited page, I listed every source that I thought I might use in the paper. But then when I actually wrote my paper, I ended up not using this book by John Giardini. Since I didn't cite this source in my paper, I had to delete it off my works cited page. Because in MLA, including sources on your works cited page that you don't actually cite in your paper is called bibliography padding or bib padding. And that's also considered a form of plagiarism, so you don't want to do that. Now, other documentation styles approach that a little bit differently, but in MLA papers, that's how you do it. Okay? Okay. I think that pretty much covers what you need to know in order to understand how to use in-text citations. Now, I realize that I haven't covered everything because there are a lot of exceptions when you're working with documentation. But I think that it's enough to kind of give you an idea of how it's supposed to be done. Remember that there is ample information in your textbook and on the Purdue OWL that can help you understand how to use documentation if you study it carefully. The experts at the Writing Center on all 3 CSN campuses are really, really good with documentation, not just MLA, but also APA and other formats as well, so they can help you. Of course, people in advising and coaching can help you. And if you have any questions about MLA documentation, as long as you're in this course, I really want to help you with this, but you need to email me through Canvas and let me know what you don't understand, because I'm just not that good at reading minds even when people are in the room with me. And when they're someplace completely different, I absolutely cannot read their minds, okay? Thank you so much for studying this video along with the other videos on MLA documentation. I know they're long and I know the information isn't really interesting, but using documentation well enough to avoid plagiarism is really important. So I really appreciate your taking the time to study this information. I hope you have some time to relax and enjoy yourselves because you've certainly worked hard on this. And like I said, I appreciate it. Until we talk again, have a good day.